everybody. This is Ryan McClanahan with HistoryThroughCards.com. Hope you're all doing very well today. You know, the other day I was listening to a podcast where the guest was saying that he didn't think that a lot of collectors actually knew who our hobby founders were, let alone Jefferson Burdick. And I hate to say this, but I think he was correct on this. A lot of other things that he was saying I didn't really agree with, but that's neither here nor there. Um, I started out collecting vintage sports cards at age 14, and I didn't know who Jefferson Burdick was either. And I only found out when I walked into that card shop, as I told you guys. Uh, really kind of walked into a card shop at the fourth grade to learn about math and problem solving skills. And it wasn't until years later that through that experience that I decided to become a writer of vintage sports cards, sets, economics and history, and all this other stuff that I wasn't learning in school. And I felt really kind of that there was something missing out of my education. And as I told you guys, it has turned out to be a really great blessing in disguise. That I was disabled. I do have cerebral palsy. Uh, it is an adventure, I'll just say. But from that anger came through a chance to basically learn again and things that I really should have learned in school. And so one of the things that my teacher had done in the fourth grade was take us on a trip to the card store again to learn about math and problem solving skills. And that's where I saw a bunch of T205s, T206s, 1951 tops, and a 1968 tops Pete Rose. And I really wanted to learn as much as I could about these cards, who made them, who the players were. And so years later, I stopped collecting modern cards, at least modern for me, back in the 1980s and early 1990s. When the 1994 players' strike happened, I'd gotten fed up, and so I went into vintage. My problem was that where do you start when you don't know anything, and there's no one really around to teach you? Fortunately for me, I did find a group of older collectors who kind of took me under their wing and taught me the ropes. I learned a lot. I'm still learning, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way, which I think you need to do in order to learn. But this is something that Jefferson Burdick actually he made a lot of mistakes in his early collecting career as well. There are still gaps in his history and in the hobby history that we're still trying to figure out. The information now is a little more accessible than it was when I was first starting collecting, and certainly when Jefferson Burdick started to found the hobby in about 1935. Now, he didn't have anything to go on, and as I say, I didn't know who Jefferson Burdick was when I was first starting collecting, because really nobody was talking about him. The first time that I heard the name Jefferson Burdick is when I had walked into the same card store and overheard the dealer and a collector talk about him. And so there were no photos and really no information for me to go by. So usually when this happens, the mind starts to fill in the missing gaps. For me, Jefferson Burdick looked more like Raymond Burr. And he actually looks nothing like that. But again, when you don't have all the information, your mind does fill gaps to try to figure things out or have things make sense. And so I actually learned a lot about Jefferson Burdick over the years and a lot of our other hobby pioneers. And I've written extensively about these guys and done a lot of research. And today, we actually do have a lot of Jefferson Burdick's original paperwork, and it has been really interesting. A lot of Jefferson Burdick's life hasn't really been talked about in the past or even in the present, and I did write a pretty extensive article on Jefferson Burdick, not just as a collector, but as a human being, as a person. And a lot of times you're going to hear Jefferson Burdick's name mentioned as the founder of the hobby or the father of the hobby, and this is actually true. But he wasn't alone either. Jefferson Burdick grew up in New York. He was born in a small town called Central Square, New York, in February of 1900. And so he first started collecting cards, we think, about 1909 or so, 1910, with the T206. He gave it up. We're not really sure when he gave up card collecting, maybe about this time as well. He said there wasn't really a whole lot to do in this town. I think the town was made up of a few hundred people at most, and it wasn't until like the 1970s that the town actually had 1,000 people. So this is really one of the reasons why he collected sports cards when he was a kid. He had two older siblings, a brother and a sister, but I don't know if the older brother actually collected sports cards. I kind of doubt it. I think he was born in the 1890s, so there's at least a decade gap there. In any event, he did go to Syracuse University School of Business Management. I wanted to look to see if that was actually still around, and it turns out that his school was still around. I actually got a hold of his records, and I found out that he actually had maybe 2 years formal education in college, and that's all he really needed. When you read over Burdick's letters and his notes, he is a very well-educated person. His style of writing is really kind of rather unique. It's very precise, and it's to the point and direct. He doesn't beat around the bush at all. He doesn't skip anything really. And one of the reasons for this is that he spent a lot of time at, we think, the Syracuse University, and so he was always in the library and he was always studying, and so you kind of get a sense of like who he is through his writing. In order for him to start a hobby, you have to have a foundation first, and he says this in his writing that there really was no foundation because really I don't think he knew that the hobby really was founded in England in 1927. But even so, that's only like five or so years into what he was doing, and even prior to that, the English hobby is something that we Americans really haven't studied in full. I haven't really studied it either. At some point I will. There are a few Englishmen who have interacted with Jefferson Burdick. At one point, Edward Wharton Tiger, who's actually called the English Jefferson Burdick. He's really fascinating too. He was a spy during World War II, and I did read his book. It's called Burning Bright, and I think he wrote it prior to his death in 1995. It's a rare book. I had to get it from a university, and even then I wanted to write more about Edward Wharton Tiger. I do want to kind of tell you guys about these hobby pioneers, because really if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have a hobby today. Jefferson Burdick was really actually, he's probably the most fascinating. He's also one of the least understood people, I think, in the hobby. His name is mentioned quite often in passing, but a lot of collectors and dealers and whomever have not really studied him in full. So I kind of hope to do this today and kind of tell you a little bit about these guys. I have written extensively about them as well, and you can find a couple of their biographies on my website. So in about 1918 or so, Jefferson Burdick, he didn't enlist in the military, but that we know of. But his draft card says that he was a mechanic, and then he goes and registers for school, and he graduates in about 1922. Jefferson Burdick went to the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago, and that's actually also where they came up with the 1933 All-Star Game as well at the Chicago World's Fair, which a lot of people don't realize. In any event, he ended up picking up a bunch of postcards of that World's Fair, and that's where he got the idea to start a hobby. And then in 1935, he started writing articles about the hobby, in about December or so in Hobbies magazine, and he wrote a bunch of them from 1935 through 1937, 1938. They are kind of interesting, and just his prefix system at the time is a lot different than it was in 1946. Say, he was always kind of trying to figure this stuff out. The only reason why we have a prefix system to go on is because in the late 1940s, he had decided that he needed to dispose of his card collection. At the time, I think it was over 300,000 cards, and he went to all sorts of museums, and each one didn't want to take on the responsibility until he met with Hyatt Mayer. And Hyatt Mayer was the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Arts in New York, and he told him, though, that if we're going to have your collection, it needs to be have a system that we know what everything is, and this is how you get, like, to say the T206, T207, and so on. And so that's what he was working on. And in fact, once he retired in about 1959 or so, he had his own desk at the museum, and you can see him there quite often doing research on his cards and mounting the cards into albums as well. And he didn't have a whole lot of people helping him at the museum. He did have one assistant, but he didn't really know how to do this at first, so he contacted an old friend of his, which was Lionel Carter. And Lionel Carter, he started out in the hobby. He's probably one of our best known hobby pioneers. In fact, Lionel Carter started out as a teenager. It was about 1936 or 1937 or so when Lionel Carter started to interact with Jefferson Burdick through his magazine, which was the Card Collectors Bulletin. And Card Collectors Bulletin was a magazine that Jefferson Burdick had to write because he had found out that there was only so much room that he could have for content in Hobbies magazine. So he had started this publication. Later on, in 1949, Jefferson Burdick asked Charles Bray to be the editor of the Card Collectors Bulletin because what was happening was that Burdick had rheumatoid arthritis, and it was very difficult for him to actually do all the work. So that's how Bray ended up with that magazine, and he wrote and edited that magazine until 1984, which surprised me. In fact, Jefferson Burdick, actually, he wasn't born with rheumatoid arthritis, but he said that in about 1931 or so, he was doing some housework, and he climbed up on a ladder, and he noticed a very sharp pain in his hands, and that's when he was really diagnosed with really kind of severe rheumatoid arthritis. And you can kind of see this in some of the photos that we actually do have of Jefferson Burdick. In fact, Edward Wharton Tiger, when he met him in 1959, he had said that Burdick was profoundly deaf, and he really was. He thought that he was seeing a dead man walking. Is really what he had said. He said that he wasn't really long for this earth, even in 1959. And Lionel Carter, he had met him after years of correspondence in 19 1952 at a hotel, and he had kind of noticed his appearance as well. His neck obviously was really bothering him, and it was kind of cocked to the side. And he gave a really thorough description of Jefferson Burdick in 1952. We do actually have a really neat photo of Jefferson Burdick and Charles Bray as well, and Lenny DiNardo, who is really considered another hobby pioneer. However, I don't know much about Lenny DiNardo. I think he was actually one of Jefferson Burdick's editors on his American card catalog. However, this is one of the problems that I think we're going to face, is that there's a lot of early card collectors and pioneers that we really don't know a whole lot about, because all this information is either lost or it's in pieces. And so I did a lot of research on these people, but there's some of these guys that I've heard time and time again who I can't find really anything about. That includes Howard Lectup, Edward Golden, who is really one of the first to latch on to Burdick's Card Collectors Bulletin, and Frank Jock. And I know there's a Frank Jock Award, at least there was in the 1970s, which was presented to a lot of the hobby pioneers for outstanding work. And then Noyes Houston was another guy where I read a lot of his notes and letters back and forth to a lot of these hobby pioneers. I can't find a lot about these guys, to tell you the truth. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of these collectors are not talking about some of these guys. Is just, the information is just not there. And what we do have is again, in pieces. I've kind of had years to try to piece together this stuff, and there's always going to be certain holes in information. This isn't necessarily true with the sports hobby either. This is also with newspapers, in fact, and general information. So a lot of our information are newspapers from the previous 50, 60, 100 years, in fact, 200 years. The only reason why we have this stuff is either because it's on microfiche or it was digitally transferred over, and you're not getting the entire picture. You're just getting one paper at a time, one document at a time. And because if it's on microfiche, you don't know how long that lasts. They said 500 years. I don't know. I'm not going to be around in 500 years. At least I hope not. In any event, the digitization process is not 100% complete anyway. It takes years for this stuff, and then there has to be a need for it and a want for it. And from what I've heard and what I've seen, the newspaper digitization process is probably like 30%, if that. So in the hobby, it's a lot less than that, and we don't have all of the documentation or the papers or articles that these guys have printed over the years, and it's not out there yet. It's all over the place, in fact. So I've written and read as much as I can to kind of present to you guys this information, but there's still a lot to go. There really is. So Lionel Carter is one of our best known collectors and researchers, and he had a 70-year writing career. He started writing when he was in high school. I think the Caw Stamp Journal back in 1936 was the first time that he wrote about sports cards. He then went on to write to Jefferson Burdick, and Burdick really kind of, I think maybe took him under his wing. Lionel Carter has a really interesting story about how he first started collecting sports cards, and I mentioned this in my look into the 1933 DeLong set, because that was the first set that Lionel Carter had ever seen. In fact, the first sports cards, and he had a choice to make. He went to a convenience store or a drugstore back in 1933, and he was on his way to the movies, and so instead of buying a candy bar, he bought 5 packs of DeLongs, and that was what started him on a hobby pursuit, if you will, a lifelong passion for him. Lionel Carter is a very fortunate person too. First, he survived World War II. He had a couple of really close calls. So Lionel Carter and another guy, Harry Lillian, who we really don't know a whole lot about, but he's also about the same age or maybe a little bit younger than Lionel Carter. These two whiz kids really taught Jefferson Burdick a lot about baseball, and Burdick really depended on them for baseball knowledge. As far as I know or anybody else knows, Jefferson Burdick never saw a baseball game, and he's really synonymous today with baseball. However, the majority of his collection is non-sports, and so it's kind of interesting that his sporting collection only consists of about maybe 13%. I read a few accounts that Jefferson Burdick had said that he had never seen, in fact. So what he had done was to ask other collectors, hey, if you guys have a copy of XYZ card, send it my way through the mail, and I'll take a look at it and write it down and then send it back. And he would do this all the time. And then the collectors would ask him, hey, can I see your T206 Wagner? And he'd be like, yeah, sure, let me send it through the mail. Okay. That actually stopped when he realized that the Wagner was really getting to be very expensive. So he stopped that. And it was also a gentleman by the name of John D. Wagner who had two Wagners in his collection, and he gave one to Jefferson Burdick. And Lionel Carter actually had a chance to purchase a T206 Wagner, but I think the gentleman who he was going to purchase it asked $125, and his wife Irma had said, yeah, you really need to get this card. And he said, no, that's too much money. And he'd asked Jefferson Burdick about it, and Jefferson Burdick said, that's really above book. And so I think that was about 1956 or so. And so Lionel Carter missed out on a T206 Wagner. Fortunately for us, we do have the majority of Lionel Carter's cards out there for collectors. I have two of them in my collection, in fact. Unfortunately, I don't have one to show you guys. Actually I do. Hold on, right? So I do try to collect some of our hobby pioneers' cards. It's not easy, in fact. A lot of them do have cards out there, but they're not graded. The card I have here, this, unfortunately it's blurry, but it's 1916, the Globe Stores, number 44, Charles Deal, and it says Lionel Carter Collection. And this is really interesting for a few reasons. First, Lionel Carter was really meticulous about the condition of his cards, more so than any other collector, I think. And so this card is in fair condition. It's 1.5, and there's a major crease across it. From what I've heard, actually, from a few letters, is that John D. Wagner had given him a box of old tobacco cards because, first off, John D. Wagner, that is, he had started his collection back around 1909 as well, and he apparently never stopped collecting. And so, as a thank you for Lionel Carter's wartime service, he gave him a box of all these cards, and I think that's what this is right here, is from John D. Wagner, because normally Lionel Carter would have said no, and he did that quite often, in fact. If he found any flaw in a card, he would just say, nope, thank you very much, I greatly appreciate it, and he would go to find another card that was in near mint condition. So it is kind of unusual that you're going to see a unflawed card, if you will, in Lionel Carter's collection. The collection itself was graded by SGC, and this is kind of interesting about this is because Lionel Carter ended up taking under his wing another collector named Bill Mastro. When Bill Mastro was a kid, Lionel Carter went back to Bill Mastro as an old man at this point, and he said, "I need to get rid of my card collection. Can you help me out?" And Bill Mastro went to Doug Allen, and Doug Allen put together the deal to have all of his cards slabbed by SGC. And so I think that was in 2006, 2007, and Lionel Carter passed away in 2008 at age 90 years old. It's a really sad story, in fact. Unfortunately, what happened was that Lionel Carter's collection was stolen. At least a portion of it was, and so he knew that he couldn't keep his collection in his home because it was too valuable. In fact, back in the 1980s, Lionel Carter had gone to a card show, really for the first time in years, and had seen a lot of what the prices were going for cards, and he was shocked. And he just said, "No more. I can't do this." At that point, he really didn't have a fundamental understanding of what was going on in the hobby. He was really a part of a different generation of collectors who didn't really care what these cards were going for, or they complained, in fact. So when Jefferson Burdick was actually forming the hobby in the 1930s, he had no guide to go on, and instead what he did was he looked at the coin industry and the stamp industry to formulate how a card hobby would work. And so that's why a lot of the prices were basically from those two hobbies, which is really kind of interesting. And he writes about this, and I actually wrote about it in my article. And so you can go step by step to see how he actually did this. And the one thing about Jefferson Burdick, and I think a lot of these card collectors, specifically Charles Buck Barker and Lionel Carter, these guys really didn't like the way that collectors were purchasing these cards. Jefferson Burdick knew that in order to have a thriving hobby, you have to have some kind of price structure associated with these sports cards. And so in the early days of the hobby, what you're seeing isn't a price guide, but it's more rather that collectors would go in his card collector's bulletin and say, "I'm willing to pay you 25 cents for a stack of cards," or 10 cents for this particular card, or whatever the case may be. There was really nothing to go on except for this. And then along comes Charles Bray, who in 1942 or early 1943, he starts a auction house to kind of liquidate an old-time collector, his collection, which was James Conklin. And Conklin is a California collector from the 19th century. He started off in about 1888 or so, or 1887, and apparently he never stopped collecting either. But he had a really fine collection of 19th century sports cards, and when he passed away, it was left up to Charles Bray to liquidate this collection, and it sold for quite a bit of money back then. About this time, Lionel Carter was in the service, Harry Lillian was in the service, John D. Wagner was in the service as well. He was a recruiter in Pennsylvania, and you have Dr. Lawrence Kurzak as well. And Lawrence Kurzak's a really interesting guy because he had collected cards in the 1930s, and he never really did anything with them. He didn't write any articles. We don't see Lawrence Kurzak's name in the hobby until maybe the 1950s and especially the 1960s. He's not really well known today, but he does have a huge collection. Prior to his enlistment in the Navy during World War II, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Kurzak was a very successful surgeon in New York City. You could say that he was on a lot of want lists. Before this, he was actually a very successful amateur tennis player as well, and he played against a lot of future Hall of Famers. You would think that the 1940s was a time when the hobby was really kind of going on the downslide, just because there were so many citizens that were going into the military at the time to fight the Nazis or the Imperial Japanese. And instead, what happened was that the hobby spiked. And this is really something that I wasn't really aware of at the time when I had written my articles on this. And then I find that Jefferson Burdick is saying in his Card Collector's Bulletin that he was surprised that the hobby was growing. And I think the hobby was growing, in fact, during the late stages of the Great Depression as well. And the cards weren't really worth a whole lot of money. But you always have to take this into consideration, what people were making as an hourly wage, and then what these cards were actually going for. So, 10 cents could have bought you a loaf of bread, and these cards were going for about 2 cents each, and it didn't really matter what card it was either. It could have been a 1939 Ted Williams or a 1909 T206 Ty Cobb or Walter Johnson. It was all the same. 3 cents here, 2 cents there. It's not making much of a difference who's on the card, except, as I say, if somebody specifically wanted that card, it would just be sent through the mail. And so I think a lot of times that these collectors, their worries were the U.S. Postal Service and the rates that they were charging for bulk services. And they're always talking about this and kind of worried about it at the same time. Will my cards get to the destination? So it's kind of like a courier service, if you will. At the same time, too, from 1938 to 1942 is when we see the checklists for the T206, T207, T205s, and others start to grow, in fact. And there wasn't any checklists prior to that. And Jefferson Burdick mentions a lot in his articles and in his own writing that it wouldn't have done any good for his generation to ask the younger generations, which would have been my grandfather's generation, the greatest generation, about sports cards or sports from 1909, 1910, or when the T206 was being issued, because A, they weren't alive, or they were just young kids at the time. And so he had to figure this out on his own, and his generation did, which is what, the 1900 generation or the 1918 generation. I kind of forget these other generations. There's also a lost generation too, and I think that was prior to his birth. In any event, he did leave up a lot of the sports cards to Lionel Carter and Buck Barker specifically, because he knew that those guys knew a lot about baseball. And from what I've heard, Lionel Carter, when he would ask you if you had a card or something like that, or if you corresponded with him, he would ask you to send a newspaper clipping of the ball player as well. And so he really did know a lot about baseball, and that was his real passion was baseball. And same with Buck Barker. And Buck Barker was born in 1911, and he was from St. Louis. And so his first time that he started collecting sports cards was 1922, when the St. Louis Browns and the Yankees had a pennant chase going on. The Yankees won by one game in 1922 to win the American League pennant. And so that was Buck Barker's first time that he collected sports cards, and first time that he actually wrote an article was, I think, about 1948 or so, and he became a contributor, a constant contributor. And what Barker would do is he would write notes on the backs of his cards, and I do have one of them. In fact, there are enough of them out there that you definitely know what they are. If you haven't, his handwriting is unusual, but you can see a lot of his note taking on his cards. A lot of people today, if they saw that, they would just die of shock, I'm sure. But these cards weren't worth a whole lot when he was doing this, and I don't know, if you guess he didn't have enough paper on him or something. This guy knew a ton of these older ball players. He researched them, and he had access to the Sporting News archives. At some point, he got those archives, and this is really why we know a lot about the players of the T206, because if you think about it, a lot of these guys were just young kids. Burdick alone was about 9 or 10 years old, 11 years old. And Wirt Gammon, who is another writer, he was about maybe 4 or 5 years younger. In fact, Wirt Gammon was born in 1905, and he didn't start writing about sports cards or the hobby until about maybe 1945 or so. And he actually was a sports writer. And so he had, I think it's called Gammon's Corner, but I've read a lot of those, and those were actually regular newspaper accounts, sport in the sports section. So Wirt Gammon is one of those guys who is a legit sports writer, and he was also a card collector from, he said, 1911. So that's pretty young. John D. Wagner, the collector, he talks about meeting John Wagner, or Honus Wagner, in 1942 in an exhibition game against the Harrisburg Senators, and this was against the Pittsburgh Pirates. So he specifically said that he didn't want kids to buy tobacco products. He didn't want any association with that. It's a little vague what Honus Wagner was talking about. Sometimes Honus Wagner was really hard to understand. He had a very thick accent. We know this because of the story of Dots Miller, and it's not dots as in like the dot itself. What happened was that there was a sports writer who had asked Honus Wagner, "Where's John Miller?" And he pointed and said, "Dots Miller." And that kind of tells you like that, you know, he may be a little hard to understand because of his accent. I think in the case of the T206 Wagner, it has been kind of sensationalized over the years, specifically with the auction houses. But John D. Wagner was really specific in his writing about this I should say specific incident, if you will, and he does a very good job of it. In fact, we still have really kind of conflicting reports about the T206 Wagner's rarity and why it is that. Again, he didn't want kids to smoke, although he smoked quite heavily. In fact, he also may have had a financial dispute with the Pirates as well. And there's another theory that I really kind of subscribe to, is the one that every sports writer was responsible for signing up the ball players for the American Lithograph Company, and a lot of the ball players on the Pittsburgh Pirates kind of said no, like, we're not gonna sign up. They had to sign up, in fact, if they wanted their picture in the set because of the privacy laws of New York. And so you have a couple of Pittsburgh Pirates players who should be in that set and are not, and one of them is Babe Adams. So I tend to think that may have had a lot to do with Wagner's decision not to be included. Again, you had to have the permission of the player to have his likeness in these sets, specifically the T206, which is the first time, in fact. And that was because of the 1909 copyright law and the privacy statute in New York. And again, I told you guys before, but that was based on a lawsuit from 1903, the Abigail Robertson case. And she had lost that case, but it did provide New York, or people from New York, with a right to privacy. And that was the first one. I'm not going to get into all of that because there's a lot there to it, but you can read about it in my website. I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, but going back to Dr. Larry Kurzrock, he's a name that really isn't discussed much, and he did start collecting in the 1930s, at least. I think he was born in 1906, and I did find an original photo from 1936 of him. And so when I do my article on him, I'll show you that. The funny thing is that a lot of these guys do not have photos of them, so it's really tough. I know there's one photo of Preston D. Oram, and Preston Oram here, he was one of the original dealers. He's kind of an interesting guy for different reasons, because Oram, he's the one. I think a lot of early collectors, they really didn't like this guy. He was a part of the original hobby pioneers, if you will, but he started out as an old man collecting sports cards. He had originally been into the coin and stamp hobbies, and then he sold those during World War II, and he got into sports cards instead. And what a lot of original letters from these guys are saying is that Oram would show up at an auction, and the next thing you know, he'd just raise his hand, every time, and it really kind of annoyed a lot of these guys. And he then ended up selling his entire sports card collection, and he was out of the game by at least 1960. He died about 1972 or so. He was born in 1894. I'm still trying to figure out a little bit more about Preston Oram. I know his father was a composer, and he had written some really interesting things as a composer. A lot of these guys, their histories are not really out there. There's a lot of digging that needs to be done, and their own paperwork and their own writing is spread all over the place. So this is really kind of, I think, where people have a hard time trying to figure out who these guys actually are. They may hear a name here and there, like Preston Oram or Charles Bray. Woody Gelman is another one. Gelman, I'm just gonna say it's Woody Gelman. I always get confused about this. So Woody Gelman was really associated with Max Fleischer, his art studio, who put out Superman back in the 1930s, and he became really heavily involved in Topps and their R&D department and their art department. And Woody Gelman had an amazing collection on his own. So Woody Gelman brought over with Topps another gentleman by the name of Ben Solomon, and he's another guy who is really very rarely talked about today, but he had a lot to do with the art department of Topps early on. But getting back to Woody Gelman there, what Gelman did was he ended up buying a lot of Topps products that they couldn't sell on clearance, and sold it through his distributorship, or his warehouse, if you will. Gelman is also responsible for the 1952 Topps as well, and he and Cy Breuer were the ones to design that set, along with other sets too. So he's really important within the hobby. He's also an editor as well of the American card catalogs, and after Jefferson Burdick died in 1963, Gelman decided to do another American card catalog, and that's the 1967. So it's really kind of interesting that these guys really felt that Burdick was the glue to this secret society, if you will, or society of sports card collectors. And I mean, these guys were not perfect by any stretch. Nobody is. You don't want perfection at all. It's our imperfections that make us human. But what Bill Mastro had told me when I spoke to him about this was that the one thing that these guys did, and they could have changed, was that they were kind of insulated from the rest of the hobby. They kind of kept to themselves, which is too bad, really, because they had information that I guess, according to Bill, that they didn't send to anybody else. They didn't really want to give out all their information. I'm not entirely sure if I agree with that. There are a lot of these collectors, these hobby pioneers, that did in fact write articles for other collectors, and Wirt Gammon was one of them, and then Frank Nagy was another. Frank Nagy was a post-war collector. He first started collecting, I think, in the 1930s, but he had, I think, joined the Coast Guard or the Navy during the Korean War, and then he came back and he started collecting sports cards. At this time, though, he was an assistant editor to this magazine right here. This is Sport Fan, and it was actually quite influential. The editor was Bob Jasperson, and Bob Jasperson really is a very influential figure within the vintage hobby, in the hobby in general. He's another hobby pioneer who's not really spoken about these days, but he did have his Sport Fan magazine here, which had a lot of other collectors contribute to, even Lionel Carter, and this was this one's from June of 1972, so it was around for quite some time. So Frank Nagy actually ended up purchasing the collection of another collector by the name of Walt Corson. As I mentioned to you guys before, that a lot of these hobby pioneers do not have photos attached to them. In the case of Walt Corson, though, it's a little bit different because I did a pretty lengthy article on him. I had always heard the name. I wanted to find out more about him. He had said that he was a minor league baseball player in the 1920s and 1930s, early 1930s, and that he had 2 tryouts with the Yankees, and he had written about this in about the late 1950s. There is a big problem here, though. He made up a lot of that stuff, and I had actually intended to write about Walt Corson because I wanted to find out more about his minor league career, and I ended up finding something completely different and unexpected, and really I was very disappointed. What happened was I couldn't find anything in the press and the newspapers about Walt Corson during his time in the minor leagues. Sometimes this really isn't anything new. The minor leagues and early football and the Negro leagues have one thing in common, and that is that a lot of times the ball players, there's not a whole lot of information to go on, and box scores are few and far between. So I figured that's what this was that he had said, Walt Corson had said that he had a very high batting average. I want to say it was in the 380s or something like that as a first baseman, and that's why he ended up getting the call to participate with the Yankees in 1926 and then again in 1934. I couldn't find anything about this. I couldn't even find a photograph, which I thought was kind of unusual, because if you're going to have a substantial batting average for the year, you're going to also have a photo of you as well. And so I went to Cooperstown to try to figure this out, and they did some really interesting research. I found who was invited to the 1926 and 1934 spring training with the Yankees, and he was not among them. And so he had actually made the entire story up. He had made up the fact that he had known and met Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and a few other guys. But the way he made it sound in the article from the late 1950s was that he was actually there when he wasn't. And I tried to figure out why he would do this. And one of the reasons I thought was really strange was that you have Lionel Carter and Buck Barker, and again Preston Oram, and those guys, again, they would have known all this stuff. They had the documentation behind them and the research materials, and same with Wirt Gammon Sr. He would have known as well about this. And so I don't know why he lied about his record or his non-record like this, knowing that you have some heavy-duty researchers. And Jefferson Burdick, I think, may have actually called out Walt Corson at one point And I don't think these guys really got along very well, and I think Burdick knew that he was not telling the truth. But again, Corson knew that he was dying of cancer in the late 1950s, and he was looking for a way for his card collection to live on, if you will, as someone to pass on to. And so he found Frank Nagy, and Nagy tells a really interesting story that he had taken out almost all of the money from his bank account to purchase Corson's collection, and his wife was furious. He thought at one point that his wife was going to leave him, in fact, but he loaded all this card collection into his station wagon, and he said it broke the springs. Frank Nagy actually sold a lot of Corson's collection throughout the years, and again, I do have a really interesting photo of Bill Mastro with Frank Nagy, and I think Bill said that Nagy was a really decent person, and not just that, he was a really decent person to do business with. He could be a little, I guess, a little testy at times, but he was very decent to people, and same with Buck Barker too. I've heard a lot of great things about Buck Barker. I mean, all these guys have different personalities. The one thing that I've never heard that these guys have ever done, whether it's Frank Nagy or Kurzak or Gammon or Gelman, is that they never really called themselves out. They never called out other people, and the way that we see today on YouTube or other platforms. I'm not a fan of that at all. If I have a problem with somebody, I'll contact them directly. Sometimes not, though. I admit I am a reporter first, and so I'm not about gotcha, but I do want the record straightened out. I want it corrected, and sometimes I have to be a reporter and not a friend. So sometimes I will call people out, but it's very rare, and I don't like to do that within the hobby, because the hobby is really kind of meant to be shared with other people, and I have met so many great people through the hobby and had so many great experiences that I want to kind of share my knowledge on to you guys, but I also want to hear what you guys have to say as well. And it's one of the reasons why I think that I started this channel, again, to learn and to educate myself and to educate you guys as well. These hobby pioneers really need to be talked about a little bit more than they are. So I agree with that. Again, I don't like the bickering that goes on within the hobby. I don't have time for it. I really don't. And I think we're only on this earth for a very short period of time. At the end of the day, my life is pretty difficult. Just being disabled. I want to go home. I want to chill out. I want to spend time with my sports cards, my friends, and just relax. And one of the ways I relax is not through alcohol or tobacco, because I don't do that stuff. I relax by checking out my sports cards, seeing what other collectors, dealers, and YouTubers have to say. And there are a few YouTubers that I do really enjoy, and I really want to learn as much as I can, because I did have a really crappy education, which is now being fixed through YouTube and through the hobby. And so the hobby has been really good to me, and I figured that I might as well give back in some form or fashion. Again, guys, I said I'm not very good at this kind of a platform. I'm a better writer than I am a speaker. So I'd rather write, but it takes a long time, and I'm writing almost on a daily basis for one outlet or another or my own. So again, guys, there's a lot here that I'm probably going to talk more about in the future. And if you really want to learn a little bit more about these guys, you can go to my website, historythroughcards.com, and you can read it. And again, I'm always around for your questions or answers. And so Guys, with that, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And if there's anything I missed, and I'm sure I have, let me know about that, okay? So, all right, guys, I'll talk to you later. Bye.